Hi everyone, so this is going to be my Unit 14 summary. So Unit 14 is for the most part all about this multiplier model. Now there are going to be other elements to it where we'll talk about how governments could use fiscal and monetary policy to have an impact on aggregate demand. But for the most part, it's about understanding the multiplier model, understanding what it can tell us. So first really important thing, what is this multiplier model about? Well, from a kind of macroeconomist perspective, what we might be interested in is if there is some increase in spending, some new spending in the macroeconomy. So the government increases spending or lowers spending, or firms decide to suddenly increase their investment spending. What we imagine is actually that the impact on GDP won't just be an increase equal to the size of that initial spending, that it's possible that the increase in GDP could be more than that, possible actually that it could be less than that. And what the multiplier model is there to do is to try and help us figure out, well, what will be the total increase in GDP as a result of some new spending. So to give a kind of sense of what the multiplier, like why do we use this word multiplier? So take these 2 bullet points here. So if the total increase in GDP that we see because of some increase in spending, if that total increase in GDP is the same as the increase in spending, then we say the multiplier is just 1, because we're getting exactly the same increase in GDP as the spending that initiated the increase in GDP. But if we see that the increase in GDP is more or potentially less than that initial increase in spending, then we say the multiplier is going to be bigger than 1 or less than 1. And we'll see in some examples how we can kind of figure out what the size of the multiplier is. So what we now need to do is kind of build this multiplier model. And the key thing for the multiplier model is an equation for aggregate demand. Right? What do I mean by aggregate demand? The total demand for all goods and services produced in the domestic economy. So the different aspects that make up aggregate demand, we've seen them already, these components. And what we're going to do here is sort of break them down even into smaller detail and see how like these smaller details will have an impact on the overall aggregate demand. Now, the first element of the aggregate demand equation is consumption, private consumption, what we're going to refer to here as aggregate consumption. And very important to keep in mind here is when we think about aggregate demand, we're almost imagining that we're thinking about the average household or kind of a representative household. So that's an important thing to keep in mind for all of this, all the rest of this video, to be honest. And maybe when it comes to investment, we're thinking about sort of a representative firm or a kind of the average firm. So consumption, we've seen capital C used in Unit 13. Now we're going to break that down further. And we're going to say that the aggregate consumption, the overall consumption that happens in the economy, is a combination of 2 things. So C0 here represents what we call autonomous consumption. And then we've got C1 times Y, where Y represents the level of national income, the level of income of maybe the average household. And C1 is something that we're going to refer to as the marginal propensity to consume. So really simply, this first bit of consumption, this is independent of people's income. So we imagine that this is the consumption that people would do regardless of their level of income. Now we're going to see there's a little bit of a flaw in this way of presenting it that I'll talk about in a second, but this is the kind of key thing to keep in mind about autonomous consumption. How much consumption a household would undertake regardless of the level of income. Whereas the second component of consumption, that does depend on the level of income. So what we're going to have next is a simple graph of this aggregate consumption function against the level of current income. And we see straight line, which makes sense given the form of the equation. It's just like a constant plus some other constant times our x-axis component. And here we are imagining that C1, this marginal propensity to consume, is 0.6. You can see that's coming from like the slope of the line. So 2 important things to pick out here. we can get what the autonomous consumption is by just looking at the y-intercept. Okay, and so that shows us when, I mean, this is the flaw. When income is 0, we're still saying that a household would consume a certain amount. So that's a kind of a slight flaw and a slight simplification here. But the best thing to keep in mind about autonomous consumption is just that it is the consumption that a household would undertake regardless of the level of income. And then we see that as income rises, the amount of consumption is going to go up. And okay, this is where this marginal propensity to consume comes in. And it's really, really quite an important concept. So let's use the number 0.6 to illustrate this. So what this means is if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, that means if income rises by, say, £1, then the amount of consumption will rise by 0.6 pounds or 60p. So out of every extra pound of income, we're assuming that the average household is going to spend 60p of that. Okay, so that's what we mean by the marginal propensity to consume. 1 unit of extra income, how much extra consumption does that turn into? So that's kind of the first bit of our aggregate demand equation. And now we're going to add a little bit more to it. We're going to add in the kind of second term, which is investment. And for the moment, we're going to ignore any government and we're going to ignore any foreign trade. We'll build those into the multiplier model in a little bit, but we're going to start kind of with some simplifications just to see how it works, how we can use it. So the second thing that we're going to add in is investment. So you can see the first red line plotted here. This is the aggregate consumption function that we had before. And now the second line adds on to that investment, kind of investment from firms. And that again, it's not dependent on the level of national income, right? We have that as just a constant. And that's why this line here is just vertically shifted upwards compared to this one. And the gap here is just equal to I, just equal to that level of investment spending. So this new line, we're going to call our aggregate demand function. It's a combination of autonomous consumption, consumption that depends on income, and investment, right? Ignoring government spending, ignoring exports and imports. So this, in our closed simple economy, would represent the level of aggregate demand. Now, the second really, really key line on this graph is this 45-degree line here, because that 45-degree line represents all of the points where the level of output and income, and those things are the same as we saw in this like circular flow diagram that we looked at in Unit 13. So this line represents all of the points where the level of output is equal to the level of aggregate demand. And why that line is so important is because we can only be in equilibrium, what we would refer to as a goods market equilibrium, somewhere along this line. Now, why do I know that? Well, because if we were not, then the level of demand would not be equal to the level of output. And that couldn't possibly be in equilibrium, right? If there is more demand than output, we have a situation of excess demand, so firms will produce more. If we have less demand than output, we have a kind of excess supply, so firms will reduce their level of output. So a goods market equilibrium, or a macroeconomic equilibrium in the sense of the multiplier model, can only be somewhere along that line. And that's why we've got kind of marked out here this point A, because if our aggregate demand function is represented by this red line here, then we know that the kind of only place where we could have a goods market equilibrium with this aggregate demand function is where this crosses our 45-degree line, which is at point A. And that would have to be a point where the level of output is equal to the level of aggregate demand. So now let's imagine a bit of a change, right? You can see I've written down here a positive aggregate demand shock. So what I'm going to imagine now is that something has happened to the level of autonomous consumption. Okay, so for some reason, some kind of like shock, don't need to go into the details, but we're going to imagine that the let me do it in red actually, yeah. So that the level of autonomous consumption has shifted up, okay? Now let's think, what's that going to do to the aggregate demand? What's it going to do to this line? Well, if C naught gets bigger, right, C naught is not dependent on the level of income. So that's just a change in where the y-intercept is. So I'm going to do my best to get this right. So this line that I'm drawing, and when I say I'm going to do my best to get this right, what I'm trying to do is make sure that the line that I've drawn here is parallel to these old ones. Now, I know I haven't done it perfectly, but let me say it should be parallel, because if this is caused by some increase in autonomous consumption, it should just be a vertical shift upwards, just a change in where the y-intercept is. So this is now the key, really, really key part of this multiplier model, which is we need to identify two things. One, where is the new goods market equilibrium going to be? And two, how do we get there? Well, let's actually start at the end, which is where is the new goods market equilibrium? Well, based on what I said earlier on, the only place it can be is where our aggregate demand function intersects, crosses the 45-degree line. This 45-degree line, you can see it's where output is equal to aggregate demand, where y is equal to AD. So I can immediately identify right here, I'll call it point B, that is where the new equilibrium, the new goods market equilibrium will be. Now, the second important thing is, well, how do we actually get there? How does the economy get from this point to this point? Well, let's kind of go through this in stages. So we begin with this level of output, right? That's marked by the point A. And then suddenly we get a shock which pushes the aggregate demand up to this level, right? At this same level of output, the same level of income, suddenly aggregate demand is up here. But now firms know that there is extra demand for goods. So what will they do in response? Well, in response, they're going to produce more output. And how much more output? Well, they're going to need to produce exactly the increase in output that will satisfy this extra aggregate demand. And so what I'm going to do here is show a move over here, because they are going to increase output to the level where output equals aggregate demand. And that's got to be somewhere on this line. Okay, so we've seen aggregate demand has jumped up, and then output increases by the same amount. And now here's the next really important step. Output is now higher, but remember the level of output or the value of output is the same as the value of income. And now people's incomes have gone up as a result of firms producing extra output, maybe hiring extra workers. And so now there is more income in the economy as a whole. And now we go back to our aggregate demand equation and we look, well, now y is bigger. And so what's going to happen is the consumption linked to people's income is now going to go up. But really, really crucially, it's not going to go up by this entire increase in people's incomes, right? Because the increase in income is multiplied by C1, this marginal propensity to consume. So if we imagine that C1 is 0.6, then that increase in income is going to boost aggregate demand further, because people are now going to have more income, but not by the full amount of the increase in income, only by 60% of it, or 0.6 times that increase. So we're going to get another push up in aggregate demand, right? And so now aggregate demand is up here, but we're still not in equilibrium, because now firms see this increase in aggregate demand, and what do? They increase the level of output to satisfy it. But now the same thing is happening again. This higher level of output, more workers employed, means more income in the economy. So again, y has gone up. So that increase in income is going to be multiplied by the marginal propensity to consume to give us an increase in aggregate demand. And then that increase in aggregate demand, firms will respond by increasing the level of output again, and incomes have gone up. And you can see this is going to carry on and on and on until we reach point B. But the other thing you can see happening is every subsequent increase in aggregate demand is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, because the increase in aggregate demand comes from the increase in people's incomes, and people are spending only a fraction of that increase in income. And so every extra bit of income they get, they spend a smaller fraction of it, and a smaller fraction of it, and a smaller and smaller and smaller amount. And that's why the subsequent increases in aggregate demand are getting smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to point B, and actually then this increase is going to be so tiny, basically zero, and we're going to be at a goods market equilibrium. So that's a really important process to understand. I'll go through it kind of again with an example in the other direction in a minute or two. But just to pick out a couple of really, really important assumptions that we are making here. So like throughout my explanation, I was kind of saying, well, firms can just increase output. They can just hire more workers. That's true, as long as we are assuming the economy starts in a position where there is not full capacity utilization, right? Where the factors of production, including like workers and capital, where they're not being used to their full extent already. Right, that's really important. If that's not true, then firms can't just then increase the level of output. So that's a really important assumption that we have. And a second important assumption that we'll come back to towards the end of the video is that we're assuming this is all happening in the short run, and so there's no opportunity for wages to increase. So in order to increase output, what firms have to do is just hire more workers, right? They can't increase the pay, increase the wages of the workers that are already there. They have to hire more workers. So that's the second important assumption that we have here. So let me clear all that. And what I'm going to do now, after a short little pause, is talk through a really similar example, but this time of a negative aggregate demand shock, and to kind of go through using this example, kind of why we use this term multiplier. And we'll see, like from this example, how we can actually calculate the size of the multiplier. But before I go into that, I'm just going to take a quick pause. Okay, so kind of picking back up. So what I'm going to go through here is an example of a negative demand shock. All right. And so we start off on this aggregate demand curve up here that's labeled AD1. And we see that that's going to cross our 45-degree line, our Y equals AD line here at point A. So that's got to be our goods market equilibrium initially. And then what we imagine is this: there is a decrease in investment of 1.5 billion euros. So investment falls from what we've got labeled I on this curve to I prime. So this is a negative aggregate demand shock. So let's kind of follow what the arrows are telling us. Well, first thing is if there's a decrease in investment, that's going to be a vertical downward shift, right, of our aggregate demand curve, because the investment isn't linked to income. So a change in investment just shifts our y-intercept. And so we get a vertical downward shift. And what is the size of that shift? Well, 1.5 billion euro is the size of that shift. But now that firms have seen a decrease in the level of aggregate demand, what will they do? Well, they'll respond by decreasing the level of output. And so they're going to decrease the level of output by 1.5. And so now we get to this point here. But we're not finished. As we saw in the previous video, now that the level of output's gone down, and this potentially means that the number of workers has reduced, and therefore that levels of income have gone down, that's going to have another knock-on effect. And it's going to mean that now aggregate demand is going to fall a bit further, because if Y goes down, then people are going to reduce their consumption, not fully by the amount that Y has gone down by, not fully by that 1.5, but by some fraction of it. And the fraction will depend on what is the value of the marginal propensity to consume. And so we see a further drop in aggregate demand down to point D. And then firms again respond. They see there's less aggregate demand, so they reduce their output, which brings us to point E. And lower levels of output means lower levels of income. Lower levels of income means a further reduction in consumption, dependent again on this marginal propensity to consume, consumption is going to reduce by some fraction of the reduction of the income. And this is going to carry on and on and on until we get to point Z, right? The point where our new aggregate demand curve intersects with the AD equals Y line. That's going to give us our new goods market equilibrium. And now what we see in the diagram, and the bit that helps us kind of now maybe understand why this is called the multiplier model, is the initial decrease here in aggregate demand was 1.5, right? That was the initial kind of negative shock, 1.5 billion euros. And if we look at what is the overall impact on people's incomes, on the level of output, and therefore on GDP, right? Because GDP measures these things, we see that the shift is actually a value of 3.75 billion euros. So the initial shock of a 1.5 billion euro drop in investment has overall led to people's incomes overall dropping by 3.75 billion euros. So these two numbers can then help us work out, well, what's the multiplier? How much bigger was the drop in GDP compared to the initial shock? And all we do is take what was the overall shock, the overall impact, 3.75 billion, divided by the initial shock, 1.5 billion, and we get a value of the multiplier of 2.5. That, and for this particular example, a shock, an initial shock, like every kind of €1 of that shock will lead to a reduction in 2.5 times more than the initial shock. And so that's where this, like, why we call it a multiplier model, because the overall impact in this case is actually bigger than the size of that initial shock. So one more thing I want to do with this example is actually just do a little bit of algebra to kind of show how we could find algebraically what would be the final level of output. And so what we need to do is use two things that we know are going to be true at the end. So I'm going to take this, first of all, AD2, right, is equal to C0 plus C1y plus I dash or I prime. So we know that our final goods market equilibrium has to be somewhere along there, right? And what's the second thing we know? The second thing we know is that our final goods market equilibrium has to be somewhere along our 45-degree line. And that's going to be where AD2 is equal to Y, like this unknown value of Y, the one we're trying to find. So if we know that both of these things have to be true, then what we can do is replace the AD2 here with Y. And so I can write that Y equals C0 plus C1 Y plus I prime. And now I've got an equation which only has Y in it, and Y is my unknown here, right? It's the thing that I'm not sure of. So quick bit of rearranging. Let's bring this term to the left. And if we bring it over to the left and then take Y out as a common factor, we'll get Y times 1 minus C1 is equal to C0 plus I prime. And that means that Y, the final level of output and income we're going to be at, can be written as 1 over 1 minus C1, and I put that in brackets, multiplied by C0 plus I prime. And again, I'll put that bit in brackets. And so this is a useful bit of math to be aware. It's a useful way that if you know what the new aggregate demand function is, and obviously you always know that the equilibrium is going to be where the aggregate demand is equal to the output, put those two things together and you can actually find algebraically what the new level of output, new level of income will be. And it's given by this equation. In this particular example, remember, there's no government, there's no kind of foreign trade. And one further thing I want to point out is this bit here, the denominator, this actually is equal to the multiplier. Now, here, and sorry if this is a bit annoying, but I'm not going to kind of fully go through why that is equivalent to the multiplier. Or I should say, the 1 over 1 minus C1. let me be careful with that, not the 1 minus C1, the 1 over 1 minus C1, that is equivalent to the value of the multiplier. I'm not going to go through fully why that is. In an Einstein in the unit, it does kind of work through why that would be true. It kind of combines together the type of reasoning that we used here with a little bit of maths around summations to show why this actually is equivalent to the multiplier. But I just wanted to point out that that term there, that's actually what we call the multiplier. In this example, we'll see with the full model, the multiplier actually is a little bit different. And I'll kind of talk through the impact of like bringing government spending and bringing imports and exports into things. But I just wanted to point that out to begin with and show where it comes from. Okay, so that is, I think, the really, really key part of this unit. That's the part where we introduce this multiplier model and try and understand what it's about. Now, what I'm going to do is go on and talk about a few things that can influence like the changes in aggregate demand. But before I go into that, again, I'm just going to take a quick pause. Okay, so after introducing this multiplier model, what we're going to do now for a couple of minutes is just look at two sort of useful ideas that can help us understand why things like autonomous consumption might change, and then in a couple of minutes more, why investment might change, what kind of factors would have an influence on that. So this kind of diagram, this diagram here is a good way of thinking about why consumption might change. And what we're trying to represent here is what are the elements that make up a household's broad wealth, okay? So, and we imagine that households have a target broad wealth, like a level of wealth that they're aiming to achieve. And so what are the different elements that make this up? We've got expected future earnings from employment. So you're imagining over the course of your working life, you've got a certain amount of money that you're expecting to come in. Financial wealth, assets like shares, stocks, even like things like dividends you're expecting to go in there. Home equity, that would be the amount of money that you've sort of put into a house. That could include the like deposit that you had to pay to sort of secure a mortgage, and then money that you've paid off towards, say, repaying the principal. And then we've also got, you can see the total value of the house is going to be that amount, the amount that you've sort of put in and paid off, plus then the debt, the like rest that you owe. But that debt, that's kind of not measured as part of your target broad wealth. Some other terms just to bring in: net worth is just the combination of your home equity and your other financial wealth. And then home equity is what is, you know, the total value of the house minus the debt, minus how much you actually owe, like still to pay on it. So this is a useful idea simply because, like, here we can see that at the moment, if you add up all these three different aspects, expected future earnings, financial wealth, and home equity, this household is at their target broad wealth. But if something changes that has an impact on some of these different factors, then maybe the household will change their behavior, in particular their consumption behavior. And what we imagine here is, so we're in early 1929, before the stock market crash, before the Great Depression, and then sort of late 1929. And this is a nice useful model because what it shows us is after this like stock market crash, lots of things change. One, people's expectations of their future earnings are going to go down, maybe because they've lost their job or they've had a pay cut and they're worried about the high levels of unemployment. Financial wealth has probably dropped because the value of stocks that you own has kind of really drastically fallen. Home equity has maybe fallen because the value of your house has dropped, right? It's now worth a lot less. And then we still got the debt. And I think that debt amount looks like it stays kind of roughly the same. But why will this have an impact on consumption? Well, because now if we look at the total broad wealth, these three things added together, future earnings, financial wealth, home equity, now it's much, much less than the target broad wealth, much, much lower. And so how will households respond to this? You can see it says it here, they're going to start increasing their savings. But in order to increase savings, they have to reduce their consumption. And so this is it's a useful way of kind of thinking through like, well, why might consumption fall when there has been some sort of shock? And in particular, why might it fall further than we expect? So I think, yeah, so this gives us, if we now kind of focus in on like, or think about what happened during the Great Depression in terms of our aggregate demand model, why we might think that we should have ended up at, say, this new goods market equilibrium, but actually ended up at a lower one. Well, if we imagine the first line here, where we get an equilibrium A, that's pre-crisis level of aggregate demand. And then after the initial stock market crash, then we see a drop in aggregate demand and a drop to point B. We expect the new goods market equilibrium to be at point B, but there might be some further impacts. So you can see the first drop caused by that initial fall in aggregate demand due to a fall in investment, right? Because businesses got very worried about the economic circumstances they were seeing. But then, because of households seeing their financial wealth, their expected future earnings, all these things fall, we might then see a further downward shift because consumption, and potentially autonomous consumption and the consumption dependent on income, those have both, but particularly the autonomous consumption has fallen. And that's going to bring us a vertical shift downwards. And we'll see later in a minute why investment might actually even fall further. And so that model above kind of indicates or gives us a good idea why the autonomous consumption might drop as a result of some sort of initial shock. Now, one other thing to mention is this term financial accelerator. So the idea here is that we could actually see kind of in negative circumstances, a much bigger fall than we'd expect. And in kind of positive circumstances, a much bigger increase than we'd expect in terms of maybe both in terms of people's consumption and maybe also investment. And the idea, particularly when we think about households, is if this shock to the economy has actually caused a fundamental change to the collateral that people use to secure loans. So to like the value of the house or value of other goods that you might use to secure a loan. Let's say there's been some increase, your value of collateral has gone up. Then when you go to a bank to borrow money, your ability to borrow might shoot up quite a lot. And that might then encourage you to borrow more and then consume more. And maybe from businesses' perspective, to maybe borrow more to invest even more. And so on the negative side, we can imagine if the value of a house falls, your ability to borrow kind of decreases quite a lot. So you're going to borrow even less, and therefore your consumption is going to drop like massively. And so that's just an important term to understand. And the key thing is the change in the value of the collateral that you might have and use to secure a loan could actually then have a big impact on the amount that you can borrow, which can then determine how much your consumption is going to fall or increase if you're a household, or how much your investment is going to fall or increase if you're a firm. So that's kind of on the consumption side, a nice model we can use thinking about wealth. Now we kind of look at the investment side and what things might have an impact on firms' decisions to invest. So where we begin here is just to consider, well, what are the options that firms have when they've made profits? So option number one is they could give those profits out in terms of dividends, which then the people who receive them could use for consumption. Second thing they could do is actually take the profits and save them, right? Buy some financial assets like bonds or pay off. I guess this is kind of saving, but paying off some debt that they have. Then obviously they could, well, let me skip to 4. They could invest at home, or they could potentially invest abroad. Now, in terms of our aggregate demand model, it's number 4 that's going to have an impact on aggregate demand, only investment at home. So what kind of factors are going to influence the firm's decision about like which of these things to do? Well, 3 things. All right. The first is, what is the kind of level of desire, or the strength of the desire to consume now? And that links to the dividend part, right? Like giving out the dividends allows people to consume. So what is the strength of the desire to consume now versus maybe to invest and earn more money later on and consume later on? Well, that's determined by the discount rate of the owner or the owners of the firm, right? How much do they value spending now versus later on? So that's first important thing. Then you got to compare that to what is the possible return from, say, the saving option, right? And that is going to be what is the interest rate R, right? So what is the interest rate you're going to receive if you just decide to save that money? And then the third thing, and this is maybe the thing that would be the least kind of solid, is what is the profit rate of investment, right? What is the actual kind of return you're expecting if you invest? And we call that capital pi. So these are the three things that a firm's gonna compare kind of in like this sort of like idealized or model terms. So if the discount rate is greater than the interest rate and greater than the expected like profit rate, then certainly you would just think, okay, let's give out the dividends, let's just use it for consumption. If the interest rate is the one that's the biggest, then pay off the debt or buy a financial asset. And this is the one we really want, if the profit rate is bigger than both the discount rate and the interest rate, then the investment will happen. And that could either be at home or abroad. And I guess this is where we might have, two separate profit rates, one for a home, one for abroad. And we're going to get investment at home that impacts aggregate demand only if that profit rate from investment at home is as big as possible. So a kind of another way that we can kind of like picture the or like imagine or think about what level of investment we're going to get is just to plot a graph of what is the sort of interest rate and then also the profit rate from investment versus the level of investment, the size of the investment that we will see. So the first line here just shows us that when the okay, so let me actually just pause for 1 second before I run through this. All right, so just picking back up. So the thing that threw me for a second is the fact that it's got interest rate and profit rate on the y-axis, but actually each of the lines drawn here, we can see it's kind of holding profit expectations constant. So it's kind of, we draw this line for a particular level of profit rate that's expected. And so these numbers here, the 4 and the 3, represent interest rates. And so what, say, this line shows us is for a particular level of profit expectations, if the interest rate is 3%, we're going to get a higher level of investment than if the interest rate's 4%, which makes perfect sense, because if the interest rate is lower, borrowing is cheaper. And so firms are likely to borrow more so that they can invest greater amounts. Now, the shift we see to a new line here, that's us then thinking, okay, now the expected profit rate has gone higher, so higher profit expectations. And so for a given level of interest, firms will actually invest higher amounts. But again, with these higher profit expectations, the lower the rate of interest, the bigger the level of investment. So those are the factors that firms kind of have in mind when they're deciding about investment: the discount rate, the interest rate, and what is the expected kind of rate of profit or like rate of return on the investment. So those are two nice useful models to help us think about the first two elements of the multiplier model. And what we're going to do now is actually look at the full multiplier model, where we bring in kind of several new aspects. So let me just kind of talk through this. This is the full equation for the multiplier model, the full equation for aggregate demand. So we still got C0, autonomous consumption, but now this second term has had a bit of a change to it. We've got C1, the marginal propensity to consume. We got Y, the income, and then we got this 1 minus T as term. And what this is here to represent is taxation, because now that we have government involved, they're going to tax, they're going to take away a certain amount of the income that households receive. So why the 1 minus T? Well, to kind of just show maybe mathematically a little bit, I'm going to ignore the C1 for a second and just expand this part out. If I expand it out, I get Y minus yt or ty. So what this is showing us is if we multiply this part out, there's your income, and then minus the income multiplied by some number t. And that number t is supposed to represent what is the tax rate that the average household is paying, right? And so overall, we take your income, we subtract the tax on that income. So this bit represents the disposable income. And so that's what this second term is now. It's take your marginal propensity to consume and multiply it by what's your disposable income. So this gives us, I suppose, the consumption that is dependent on the level of disposable income. Then we've got I, still the same thing, investment. We've now got G, government spending. That's going to add to demand. We've got exports, so demand for products produced in the domestic economy from people abroad. And then we've got this last term, a minus term, so minus my. So this overall does represent imports. And what we imagine is that imports are actually dependent on the level of income. And so, the higher the level of income, the more people will import. The lower the level of income, the less. But we imagine that it's a little bit like this term here, that there will be a certain fraction of income that is used to buy imports. And this M here, I won't write it out fully, but this M represents what's called the marginal propensity to import. It will again be a number between 0 and 1, and it's telling us what, for every, say, increase of £1 in your income, what proportion, what fraction, how much of that £1 would you use to buy imports? And that's a minus because obviously imports, that is income that's been earned in the domestic economy being used to buy something abroad. So that's a reduction in our aggregate demand. So that's just this expanded model. Now, in terms of kind of like how you could think through positive shocks and negative shocks, well, it's the same sort of idea, right? So I'm just kind of like sketching out, maybe that's our initial aggregate demand. And then we've got, very importantly, roughly our 45-degree line. And so maybe that's where our initial equilibrium, goods market equilibrium would be. And then, we can now imagine lots of different types of shocks that could happen that could change the aggregate demand. So we could, like before, have a shock to aggregate consumption, or we could have a shock to investment, or now we could have a shock to government spending or exports. Now, shocks to these things, or changes to, say, like tax, changes to marginal propensity to import, they would actually have an impact not only on the vertical position on the y-intercept, but actually we could also change the slope of the curve. But we won't kind of think through those kind of examples now. But let's say we can imagine government increases spending. Right, what's that going to do? It's going to give us, doing my best to make it parallel shift upwards, new goods market equilibrium here, say B. But how do we get there? It's the same sort of explanation, right? Increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in output. Increase in output means higher incomes. Higher incomes means more aggregate demand, and so on, and so on, and so on, until we get to that goods market equilibrium. So maybe the one new element to just go through is, what will the multiplier look like now, and how will it be different to that simpler model we had before? So this is our aggregate demand equation. And again, we know in the goods market equilibrium that the aggregate demand has to be equal to the level of output and the level of income. So let's substitute that in here, and we get y equals C0 plus C1, 1 minus t times y plus I plus g plus x minus my. And now, a little bit more complicated than before, we're going to bring all the terms with y in them to the left. And so we're going to get y minus C1, 1 minus t times y plus my equals C0 plus I plus g plus x. Now take the y out as a common factor, and we get 1 minus C1, that's a 1 minus t plus m. and that's all equal to C naught plus I plus G plus X. And so now Y, right, this is that like the final level of output and income is going to be equal to, so 1 over 1 minus C1, 1 minus T plus M, and then multiplied by C naught plus I plus G plus X. Oh, no. Sorry about that. A little bit of messiness, but let's, okay, undo that. And then let me add the bracket in. Okay, so really similar derivation to the one that I did before. And now this term here, the 1 over 1 minus C1 times 1 minus T plus M, this is now our multiplier, right? So in the full model, we see a different multiplier. And the reason I wanted to go through this is just to think, well, what's this going to do we suspect, to the multiplier? Well, compare it to what we had before, which is just 1 over 1 minus C1. So now we're taking that C1 and we're multiplying it by 1 minus T. We're multiplying it by something that's actually 1 minus T. T is somewhere between 0 and 1. We're multiplying it by something less than 1. So that means this term, that's definitely smaller than C1. So we're subtracting something smaller. And now also we're actually adding something on. So what does that mean overall about the denominator here? It means compared to this one over here, that denominator is going to be bigger, right? Because we're subtracting a smaller term than we were here and now adding something on, which means the overall value of the multiplier, this whole thing, is going to be smaller compared to that simpler model. And that's, to be honest, that's not unsurprising, because given that now we've introduced the possibility of taxation and money kind of leaving due to imports, that gives more avenues for the income to sort of leak away. And therefore you would expect the multiplier to be smaller because the incomes are not all, or, you know, it's not kind of all being multiplied by C1 and then being spent. Some of it's being taxed, some of it's being used for imports. So this is just mathematically showing why when we have the full model, we would expect a smaller value for the multiplier. All right, so I think before I go on to the next bit, again, just going to take a quick little pause. Okay, so just picking back up. So what I'm going to run through for most of the rest of this video is ways that the government can get involved and try and have an influence on what happens to aggregate demand and kind of the extent of the positive like change, if there's been some nice positive shock, or trying to sort of dampen some negative shock. So 3 ways that government spending and taxation can dampen fluctuations, as in make the fluctuations not so severe. One is just size of government. If government is bigger and is providing a bigger proportion of aggregate demands, say for example because of lots of spending on health or education, then changes in the other components are not going to have as much of an impact. So larger government could therefore have a stabilizing effect. And then second thing I should point out, tax rates as well, because we saw if you increase the tax rate, that means a smaller multiplier, and that could work both kind of on the positive shock side and on the negative shock side. Then government also providing unemployment benefits. So this is the one that could maybe have an impact on the consumption side, that if households know that unemployment benefits are going to be available, then maybe they wouldn't decrease their consumption so much when there is some sort of like shock. And then the final thing is just the government could decide to actively intervene and try and do something to change the level of aggregate demand. And that's what we mean by the use of fiscal policy. Now, 2 terms I think I just wanted to talk about. They're important things to understand. So one is called the paradox of thrift, and the other is the fallacy of composition. And so the paradox of thrift so the example that we get here is, imagine a single household. They've seen some sort of like shock to the economy, and what do? They start to save some money away, right? It seems like a very, very sensible decision. But if every household did the exact same thing, if every household reduced their consumption and saved more, then based on our model, we would see that the level of autonomous consumption would drop. And that could actually mean then we move to a new goods market equilibrium where the level of national income has gone down. And so everyone's decision to save, everyone's decision to be, say, thrifty, has actually had this really negative impact and brought incomes down. And this is like a really important insight, and an insight that illustrates this fallacy of composition, which says that what we mean by that is what's true for one part of the economy, not necessarily true for the whole part. That, what could be a good decision for an individual household, like saving when you've experienced a negative shock, if all households do that same thing, actually you might end up with lower levels of income because of that reduced consumption. Just two important terms I wanted to kind of point out, particularly really easy mistakes to make when you're thinking about macroeconomics, that you don't kind of consider like what will be the effect of every household doing that same thing. Okay, so next, just really quickly, simple use of this multiplier model to explain why things like automatic stabilizers, so say like unemployment benefits, things that kick in when there has been some sort of, say, increase in unemployment or some negative economic shock, or fiscal stimulus, say a government's decision to increase its spending, why those could actually mean that we don't end up in as bad a situation as we'd expect. So like what we're seeing here is we start with at point A, and there's some sort of economic shock, and as a result, it says lower level of consumption, lower level of autonomous consumption, that shifts us down here, where we would expect the new goods market equilibrium to be at B, with a significant drop in the level of output and incomes. But if when this shock happens, the government sort of steps in and actively increases its spending, or there's some automatic stabilizers like unemployment benefit, which, be careful, would not go into government spending because unemployment benefits a transfer payment, so actually would go into consumption, then that could actually push aggregate demand back up. And so we actually end up at goods market equilibrium C. And so this sort of fluctuation, this negative shock, isn't as bad because of either fiscal stimulus, the government decides to increase spending, or just the impact of these automatic stabilizers. But so this is the way that the government can be useful, but there are actually also things the government could do that could make things worse, and what we say amplify the fluctuations. So here, again, we're imagining a similar like beginning point and a similar scenario where we're at point A, and then there's been some shock that's led to consumption, autonomous consumption falling, which would move us down to point B. But the government, for some reason, decides now that there's been this shock to the economy, maybe the best thing we can do is try and like balance our budget. So either we're going to decrease government spending, maybe increase taxation, but here it's lowering government spending. That's going to actually push aggregate demand even further down. Now, this seems like really, based on this model, really counterintuitive. Like, why would you do this? In a couple of minutes, we'll go through why a government might be forced to do this, why their finances might mean that they have to. But yeah, so these, and just to quickly look at this table, this kind of illustrates ways that, so both through the private sector, so like firms and households, or through government and central bank, how they could dampen shocks, right, make them not so bad, or amplify the shocks. So from the private sector perspective, this is very much about households. The desire to smooth consumption, that can mean that households are not going to massively increase consumption when they suddenly, say, get higher incomes, or like massively decrease it. They're going to try and maintain a kind of constant level, and that will help to not push aggregate demand up or down too much. And from a government's perspective, automatic stabilizers or particular policies, so like increased government spending or lower taxation or vice versa, or monetary policy, the central bank deciding to change the base interest rate, these things could dampen the shocks. In terms of amplifying shocks, well, what if households are struggle to smooth their consumption because they're credit constrained? That could be a problem. We saw this before, this accelerator effect. Well, if collateral is rising or decreasing in value, and that then so increases wealth above the target level, so then suddenly consumption is going to like skyrocket because households are feeling really wealthy, or the opposite. Then this one. So what if the higher levels of output mean that capacity utilization, the use of factors of production, is getting like closer and closer to maybe the maximum, and that could encourage firms then to really boost their investment spending, and that can then further push aggregate demand up. Now, in terms of governments, so amplifying mechanisms that could reinforce shocks, make the shocks worse. Well, what if they limit the scope of automatic stabilizers? Imagine something like making it really difficult to access unemployment benefits so that consumption doesn't get stabilized. Deciding not to run a deficit in a low demand period, right? Deciding to say, try and balance the budget when there's low demand, or deciding not to run a surplus, not to try and say increase taxation during a boom. So these kind of like basically mistakes could actually make the situation worse. And the Great Depression, the beginning of the Great Depression, is a good example of when an administration, the Hoover administration, did do this. They did make things worse. So another term, just before we get onto the next bit, just an important term to understand is the idea of crowding out. So just before I actually explain this, just going to take a quick pause just to make sure I get this right. Okay, so just picking back up. So the idea of crowding out is another important term to be familiar with. So this is when the government actually trying to get involved in say like particularly in investment, they're trying to kind of get hold of money, borrow money in order to say fund infrastructure projects, how this could potentially crowd out private like attempts at investment. And where this can be particularly problematic is when the economy is close to say full capacity utilization, right? So if the like level of output, or we're getting really close to like the highest possible level of output that the economy can produce, and then the government want to increase spending and potentially increase sort of like government investment, well, what could actually happen is this could have two impacts. One is then, because the government's providing all this demand, private firms, they're not going to do it, right? They're going to be kind of crowded out of this market. They're not going to do the investment themselves. But a second negative impact is it actually could end up pushing interest rates up. So why might that be? Because if there's all this demand for, say, borrowing to fund investment by governments and maybe some from firms, then the people who are lending this money, they're going to respond to all this demand, and they're going to think, well, hold on, we can actually maybe make some more profit here. So loads of demand, let's increase the price of borrowing, let's increase the interest rate. And that could be precisely what the government does not want to happen, because a higher interest rate could then depress consumption and elsewhere. So this is like two issues of crowding out. One, you stop the private sector, maybe funding and spending on the investment, and also you could inadvertently push up interest rates if there is this really high level of demand for borrowing to fund investment. Okay, so what I wanted to quickly talk about is, like earlier on, you said governments could kind of make mistakes and make the situation worse when there's some sort of economic shock. So one reason why that could happen is because of the state of government finances. So what do we mean by government finances? Well, government takes in revenues, normally from like taxation, and then there's government expenditure, right? Spending on goods and services the government needs. Also, that government expenditure would include transfer payments, right? And be careful. Government spending in the aggregate demand equation doesn't include those transfer payments. But when it comes to like the actual expenditure, then yes, that's going to be part of their actual budget. So if revenues are greater than expenditure, then the government has a surplus. If the opposite is the case, if revenues are less than expenditure, there's a deficit. And an important term to understand is if there's a primary budget deficit. So that means even if we exclude interest that needs to be paid on debt, if there's still a deficit, then we call that a primary budget deficit. A few other things. If there is a primary budget deficit, if expenditures are greater than revenues, then what's the government going to have to do? Well, they borrow. And one way that they can do that is through government bonds, where they basically sell these government bonds, which are a promise to kind of pay the person who buys the bond, pay them sort of a regular payout. And then when the bond reaches maturity, it reaches sort of like the end of the period, the person then basically, gets their money back with some interest on top. So in order to basically fund expenditure, if it's greater than revenues, a government might have to issue these bonds. So this is what then kind of can potentially cause a government to do something that might actually reinforce a negative shock. So if a government's in a position where they actually have way more expenditure than revenues, and they're funding that by providing lots of government bonds, but then people who are buying the bonds lose faith in that government's ability to repay, and then are thinking like, we don't want these bonds, let's get rid of them, let's sell them, and the bonds sort of become worthless. You then have what's called a sovereign debt crisis, where people have so little faith in that country's bonds that they don't want to hold on to them, and therefore the government can't borrow. And then what might be the only response if you cannot fund the expenditure? Well, you just have to either try and increase your revenues by increasing taxes, or you just got to cut spending somewhere. And that's why governments might be forced into austerity policies. And to an extent, that was what happened to like Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Ireland after the financial crisis, during this like Eurozone crisis, is they were forced to adopt austerity because their government bonds kind of lost a lot of value in people's minds. So that could be why a government's sort of forced to kind of make the situation worse. Now, this bit I think I'll run past. It's just a bit of a summary of like what we can take away from, what governments can do in terms of fiscal policy to make things better, or where things could actually get worse. One final thing, though, just to mention before kind of wrapping up, is trade and fiscal stimulus. So one thing we really got to bear in mind if you are making policy for a government and you're thinking about introducing fiscal stimulus, is what if some of the extra incomes that people receive from, say, a boost in government spending, what if a lot of that extra spending actually goes on imports, right? Then the multiplier you see could actually end up being really, really tiny, because people are just using the extra income to buy imports. And that's happened in a couple of cases in the textbook. It gives this example, I think, of France and Germany in the 1980s, that the French government tried to introduce a fiscal stimulus to boost people's incomes, but most of the impact was then seen on imports of German goods. And so it was actually the German economy that benefited the most from this. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. So in terms of wrapping up, what I want to do kind of quickly is talk about the crossover between these kind of two models that we've seen, the labor market model and this aggregate demand model. So I'm going to do that, but just before I do, just going to take a quick pause. Okay, so just to finish off, just to kind of, I suppose, foreshadow things that are going to come in future videos. What we have so far in terms of macroeconomics is this labor market model, which shows us an equilibrium in the labor market is going to be determined by the price setting curve, the wage setting curve, and where those two things intersect. And then we've had this demand side model, right? The demand for kind of all goods and services, and these link together because in order to produce goods and services, one thing that's going to be required by firms is labor. So we can make a bit of a simplification to link these things together. And the one ingredient we need is something that links output and level of employment. And we can come up with a production function, which basically says that the level of output is equal to lambda, the average productivity of labor, times n, the number of workers. And we can make this even simpler. If we assume that lambda is equal to 1, then we basically say that the level of output is the same as the number of workers. Right, really simplistic, like really kind of big simplification. But by doing that, we can then make a direct link between this bottom diagram and the top diagram, which is, let's imagine that we're in normal times and we're at point A here in the goods market. We've got a goods market equilibrium, and that corresponds to an equilibrium in our labor market as well, right? That this level of output requires the exact same level, or like the level of output required means we know exactly through this simplification how many people are going to be employed, and we've got both a goods market equilibrium and a labor market equilibrium. But in the goods market, it's possible that we could see some sort of change, right? Aggregate demand shifts up or shifts down. So imagine it shifts up. So we get this new goods market equilibrium, which is at point B, which requires a higher level of output and therefore a higher level of employment. And here's the really key thing. Although that's a goods market equilibrium, that is not necessarily a labor market equilibrium, because the goods market is a short run model, right? And what I mean by that, I'll clarify in a minute or two, but the labor market is more a medium and potentially long run model. And so just because we have a goods market equilibrium where there's a higher level of employment, that would not correspond to then having a new labor market equilibrium with that higher level of employment. And a similar thing if there's, say, a decrease. So a short run equilibrium, an equilibrium in the goods market, does not necessarily translate into a new labor market equilibrium. So maybe to make this a bit clearer, let's clarify what's the difference between short run and long run. And it's not so much about like an element of time, right? It's not about time, it's about the assumptions we're making about what's changing and what's not changing. So in a short run model, which the multiplier model is, the things that we assume are sort of fixed or exogenous, things that we kind of assume are staying the same unless there's some sort of shock to them. So prices, firms can't change their prices, they can't change wages, they cannot change the level of capital that they have. There's no change to technology, there's no change to institutions. And so the only things that we see in our demand model that we can understand the changes is the level of employment, the level of demand, the aggregate demand, and the level of output, and that's it. And so in the short run, like I said, we could have a new goods market equilibrium with, you know, a higher level of output, and for that short run, a higher level of employment. But that wouldn't necessarily translate into a medium run equilibrium, because in the medium run, we assume that firms can change prices and wages, and that in response to some change in aggregate demand, they might do that. They might change prices and wages, but in the short run, we assume they can't. So that's a really important point that will come back again in the next couple of units, that which model we use, and whether we're in the short run or the long run, it really depends on what things are we assuming can and cannot change. So that's why here with the multiplier model, we can have a new goods market equilibrium, but it doesn't translate necessarily into a new labor market equilibrium. Okay, so I think that's where I'll leave it for this unit. As always, I hope it helped. Yeah, thanks for watching.